This is a short video on the text City of Ghosts by Bali Rai. We will be looking specifically at literary techniques used by the author. Our focus will be to develop an understanding of how Bali Rai constructs meaning in his text City of Ghosts. As part of the assessment rubric, which you will receive as part of the essay assessment task, one of the criteria considers how the author constructs meaning within the text. In order to successfully address this criteria, students need to generate a cogent discussion that incorporates details as to how the author has constructed meaning with a critical analysis of and reference to specific narrative structures and techniques. Bali Rai has constructed this text in order to jump back and forth between time periods, locations, and situations. On the surface, it makes aspects of the text rather difficult to follow, as the narrative line of one particular character can become rather disjunct. The function of this disrupted narrative structure, however, is to generate a level of suspense for what is to come, much in the same way that a soap opera program leaves viewers hanging with a series of cliffhangers that need to be resolved at a later time. Let's look at the creation of tension through the nonlinear narrative structures. The multiple narratives are summarized as the love story between Gurdjieff and Sonny. This narrative is set in Amritsar in 1919 and weaves its way through the entire text and ends happily with the idea that Gurdjieff will leave the massacre to be with Sonny. The love story between Bisson and Lillian. In this narrative, the line begins with Bisson's recollections of his time in the First World War, fighting in Neuve-Chapelle, France in 1915. After being injured during an attack in Neuve-Chapelle by a German soldier, the narrative jumps ahead 6 months, with Bisson lying in a hospital ward recovering from his injuries. There is a considerable gap in the text between the attack on Bisson and this next scene, subsequently generating the tension and suspense as to whether he is alive or not. This is then followed by another jump as we wait to see if he has been successful in escaping the ward to be with Lillian. Lastly, this is concluded with the tense situation that Bisson faces after being discovered as a runaway soldier in a foreign country. We obviously know the outcome of this situation as we have already encountered Bisson back in Amritsar in 1919. The final aspect of tension comes from the fact that, while in Amritsar, we see Bisson anxiously waiting for word from Lillian as to their future together. This knowledge comes in the form of a letter that acts as a quasi-epilogue at the end of the text, leaving readers with the news that Lillian has been hiding the fact that they have a son together, Thomas, while at the same time we have just learnt of Bisson's death at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. We also have the stories of the revolutionaries. Jeevan drifts from his friendship with Gurdjieff and becomes involved with Hans Raj and his gang. The backstory around Hans Raj is very suspicious, with an implied affiliation with the British, possibly to generate trouble that can be reacted upon by the British forces in place in Amritsar. As this narrative progresses, the group of revolutionaries become increasingly irate with the situation in Amritsar and India as a whole. This peaks in the violence that erupts at the station near the British base, where we learn how violent Pritam can be as he clubs a man to death. Ram is killed in this altercation also. This is followed by a scene back in the heart of Amritsar where the gang go to the National Bank where they find 2 Englishmen. They are dragged out by the gang and Pritam pressures Jeevan to set them both on fire, which he does. The story of the gang ends in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where Jeevan drags Pritam forward to face the line of armed British soldiers. The remainder of the gang have fled, but Jeevan, who has been motivated to redeem his actions at the bank by Hira, takes Pritam with him in order to end the violence and bloodshed. This storyline builds in the latter half of the text to this climactic scene, where we learn the fate of Jeevan. The text as a whole is bookmarked with a brief story of Udham Singh. This framed narrative only gives a snapshot of his storyline at the beginning and middle. We are left hanging at the beginning of the text with Udham about to kill O'Dwyer. Later we find out what has actually happened to him, after he has committed the murder, and at the end of the text, we learn the reasons why he goes about doing what he does. If we look at the backstories, we can firstly consider Hera. Hera is a floating character within the text, omniscient and seemingly powerful. Whilst she interacts with and influences the narrative storylines of a number of other characters, her backstory is one that unfolds slowly and climaxes in the altercation between Soni and Moni, and Darshana and Gulbaru. As we interact with Soni and Darshana, we learn of how Hera met her fate, and the reasons she has for wanting to watch over her daughter. The British are continuously referred to as the 1919 narrative progresses. Each snippet provides the reader with some indication as to the tension that is building in Amritsar, and the role the British play in bringing that tension to a head. This tension obviously climaxes and overflows in the massacre at the end of the text. It also provides the impetus behind the tension within the framed narrative involving Udham Singh. Let us now consider the visual changes used throughout the text by the author. Firstly, the text is visibly divided into 7 parts, with a prologue of sorts introducing the framed narrative Udham Singh, and an epilogue being Lillian's letter to Bissen. The parts serve the function of dividing up the central 1919 narrative line with flashbacks and tangents that assist in generating tension. Each of the time periods within the text is visibly outlined with a change in font to assist in keeping track of the time that the author is making. We have separate fonts used for Bissen's storyline in 1915, Udham Singh's thoughts in 1940, as well as the central action of the bulk of the characters in 1919. Bali Rai has constructed this text in order to jump back and forth between time periods, and this generates a juxtaposition of storylines. Let us now consider these. This is a modern text that has quite strong similarities to the structure of modern cinema, in that stories are freely juxtaposed over one another, often to the confusion of readers. We see, for example, Gurdyal and Jeevan's stories as orphans branch outwards into stories about Gurdyal's love for Soni and Jeevan's pursuit for family. These come back together again at the end of the text when Gurdyal finds Jeevan after he dies at the massacre. From this storyline, we are also introduced to Bissen and his story, then branches out and is layered over the top of all the other action with recollections as well as action interweaving with those of other characters in 1919. We also have the Singh family and their story, the history with Hera, Darshana's desperation to have a boy, and Soni's desires to be with Gurdyal. The stories of the revolutionaries and the British once again add layers to these. The effect of this layering of stories is that we are drawn in as readers, wanting to resolve the suspense by finding out what has happened to each group of characters. The juxtaposition of them all also reinforces to the reader how the massacre at the end affects all of the people involved and not an isolated group. It touches the Punjabi people present, Lillian as she waits for Bissen thousands of miles away, even catching up with the British 20 years later. The multitude of characters also adds a very complex layer to the text, as we are forced to continuously refocus our attention on the action at hand.